That is Monday at noon. Your papers must be in my box, at least in Arson Spencer Hall. Give the papers to the secretary, or place them yourself in my box. But I will not accept papers after that. We had plenty of time and plenty of notice with respect to your papers, and make damn sure that Grandma is feeling good and doesn't die, because that'll be rough. That's just one of those unfortunate contingencies of life that you're not able to get paper in due to circumstances of that sort. All right, there's a lot of material that I want to cover. Last time, I stressed Descartes, I stressed Nietzsche's anti-Cartesianism. That is, his naturalism stands resolutely opposed to Cartesian dualism. That is, the mind-body dualism, the two-substance view of nature in the world that makes mind radically distinct from body. It is very important that one recognizes how deep his anti-Cartesianism goes and just what this involves. The Oxford philosopher at the middle of this century, Gilbert Ryle, wrote a book critical of, devastating critique, so some thought, of Cartesian dualism. And he coined the expression ghost in the machine. This view of Descartes, essentially, the body is thought of as a machine, as a mechanism, and the mind is a sort of immaterial ghost that inhabits the body. Now, Ryle's approach was very, very interesting. Unfortunately, he did a marvelous job of exorcising the ghost, but he left the human being as a machine. And this is absolutely opposed to Nietzsche's position here. That is, he is not a materialist, Nietzsche is not a materialist, and he is not a mechanist. I mean, with respect to the human being, we are living, stressed animals. And life is something radically different from the inanimate. There is an enormous gulf. In that respect, philosophers have tended to have much too meager a conception and a view of what it is to be a living human organism, not just a corpse, what it is to be living and the difference between the animate and the inanimate. So, in this respect, human beings as living organisms are not corpses. They're not just materially extended things, and we are not mechanisms or mere machines. In this respect, it is interesting to make the analogy sometimes between an organism, a living organism, and a human being, and a machine. I'll focus in on that, speaking about the position that Nietzsche would obviously have towards artificial intelligence today. That is, analogies may be illuminating, but we must not forget that living human beings are not machines, and they are not explicable solely in terms of machines and mechanisms. That is extremely important if you are going to understand Nietzsche's views. He is not a reductionist. That is, living human organisms cannot be reduced to merely material systems, as it has traditionally been understood, nor explicable in terms of mere machines. That is, there's a difference between the chemistry of the inanimate, a subtle difference, not a sharp difference, and the chemistry of the living organisms, biochemistry. And it is very important that we come to grips with and understand this difference. This is what is meant by saying Nietzsche is not a reductionist. That is, the phenomenon of life is at a certain level so that it cannot be understood merely in terms of the phenomenon of the non-living. That is very important that one understands this. He is not a vitalist. His emphasis is upon life. But he does not think that life involves some mysterious, non-natural property. You do not need to invoke supernatural agencies. There is nothing magical in that respect about life. But biochemistry is at a certain level of complexity. A level of complexity that is different than what you can call inorganic chemistry. That is, with respect to living systems, they are highly structured and highly organized. The chemistry of carbon is extremely vastly more complicated than that of the other elements when it comes to understanding, for example, DNA, which Nietzsche didn't know about at that time, or RNA, but particularly the chemistry of very, very complex protein systems. So that I've said before, and this is what is important, he has an emergent conception of nature in which it is hierarchical. You have phenomena at certain level of complexity and simplicity, and you have more complex systems in which you have the possibility of sentience and all of the complex sort of things that characterize living systems. And as living systems become more complex, that is more ordered, and there is a systematic connection between the organs, between the various aspects of the organism, a new level of phenomenon arises on the basis of the old. The simpler structures are necessary to support the supervenient, more complicated sort of processes that characterize more complex living systems. That is very important. You do not need, in this respect, any supernatural nor non-natural agency in order to understand the phenomenon of life. This is what I mean by saying he is non-reductive. That is the notion of emergence. Even at a very simple level, as I mentioned before, when hydrogen gas and oxygen gas react chemically, not when they are mechanically mixed, but when there is a chemical reaction, the structure of hydrogen and oxygen change with respect to forming this molecule. And it has properties that the elements themselves do not possess, that are both gases. I mean, water in that respect is a liquid. And its properties are properties that are not reducible simply to hydrogen and oxygen. It is not a mixture of those things. It is something that is at a higher level. This is the notion of emergence. That is also what happens with respect to the chemistry of carbon compounds. When they reach a certain level of organization and complexity, you have life. Along with it, then, eventually, you have sentience. You have feelings. Eventually, you have consciousness. These are all natural phenomena that are emergence in nature. In that respect, nature is extraordinarily rich. All of the diversity, all of the novelty. And here Nietzsche stresses diversity in nature, and he stresses novelty, genuine novelty and creativity that emerges out of it. In that respect, the old conception of Mother Nature, the womb of nature, out of which emerges, in the course of history and development, new properties, new characteristics, and new systems. But they can all be understood in perfectly naturalistic terms. You do not need to invoke the non-natural. In that respect, we still know very little about living organisms. I mean, the science of biology is still relatively young. There is a good deal to learn about living systems. dynamically, their physiology, embryology, how they develop. That is development and how they function, the physiology. The neurophysiology of the brain and nervous system is in its infancy. It is said that the next century will primarily be devoted to understanding the function and the operation of the brain and nervous system. We are a long ways from understanding it. But Nietzsche is quite firm and confident. We do not need to invoke non-natural or supernatural agencies, some sort of a mysterious, non-spatial, non-physical sort of entity or force in order to account for the phenomena of life, and of consciousness. That is not necessary at all. He has a holistic view in his approach to life and the individual organism. What I mean by a holistic view is we are organisms, that is, there are systems, organs, that are interactive. They interact dynamically. They must be understood functionally. You have to understand the organism as a whole, a dynamic whole, consisting of systems in dynamic interaction. In that respect, you cannot understand the heart, simpliciter, fully, in terms of the economy of the body, by understanding that organ alone and in isolation. The same is true with respect to the brain and the nervous system. It is in interaction with other organs within the body, and the bodily organism as a whole is in dynamical interaction with its environment. And these factors must be understood and factored in. That is the dynamical interaction with living organisms with each other socially and with the physical environment. It is very important that you see and understand, because in this respect Nietzsche's view is not simple. It is extraordinarily complex and it is extremely subtle. It does not fit into the ordinary categories with respect to understanding dualism or Spinozistic monism. He is not an idealist and cannot be understood in terms of the philosophy of Berkeley subjective idealism. He is not a materialist and cannot be understood in terms of materialism. That is to misunderstand his naturalism. And as a matter of fact, what happens over and over again, the simple-minded get a hold of Nietzsche and distort it, because they really do not have any sense of the complexity that you might have in a philosopher, a philosophical position, and the subtlety that he has. In that respect, he is like Wittgenstein. He rejects all of these isms and maintains they are all confused. Not only the subjective idealism of Berkeley, but the transcendental idealism of Kant. That is why you have to understand very, very carefully, be careful in dealing with Nietzsche's philosophy, because the traditional problems either do not occur on Nietzsche's view, or they are radically transformed, and one has to think them through in a radically different way. Nietzsche represents a break with the history of philosophy, a break with empiricism, a break with rationalism, a break with the philosophy of Kant, or Hegel, or Schopenhauer, or Kierkegaard. In that respect, one has to reconceive and rethink the problems through in a completely different way. One has to take that into view and to recognize that all of his interpretations and ways of understanding man and nature are non-teleological. That is, you do not explain things in any other way except efficient causes. You explain events in terms of natural selection, efficient causes, in terms of chance operations of a combination of factors that are conjoined accidentally in the course of history. Much of history can be understood in terms of chance. In that respect, Nietzsche conjectured, above and beyond his times, that the statistical procedures would prevail more and more in terms of science. That is the idea that you have simple linear functions, laws of nature, causal laws, so that you can plug in the variables and predict a specific event occurring at a specific time. That is, the classical equations of classical physics would soon be gone, because he thought that the phenomena of nature that lent themselves to such simplistic accounts were relatively few, of the sort that had been explored for the most part by Newtonian physics, by Newtonian dynamics, Newtonian physics, Newtonian dynamics, that pretty well exhausted itself in the 18th and the early part of the 19th century. Thermodynamics, you have to understand, that is heat, the laws of heat in statistical terms, as he understood Boltzmann's treatment of thermodynamics. That is, that second law of thermodynamics, the law of increasing entropy, is a purely statistical sort of law. If you follow through what he said, he is the one that would have anticipated, not been in the least bit surprised by the development of quantum mechanics. Because quantum physics in this century, what it has done is to explode classical Newtonian mechanics. And in exploding classical Newtonian mechanics, it explodes the idea that the fundamental laws of nature respecting elementary particles and the behavior of elementary particles are what? Classically determined. So that, for example, you can take the position and the velocity of an electron measured as closely as permissible, and with the equations of quantum physics, you cannot predict exactly where an electron is going to be at a given time, and it's inherent in the laws of physics, this indeterminacy in it. That is the role of chance at the level of elementary particle physics. This is a finding just as clear on any interpretation that you have, whether it is Heisenberg's matrix mechanics, or whether it is the wave mechanics of Schrödinger, or whether it's the statistical interpretation of these by Max Born. Nothing is clearer with respect to modern physics that has really jolted the philosophical consciousness of a people than the recognition that chance lies at the very basis and heart of nature. It's a sort of philosophy that Peirce called Tukism, after the Greek goddess Tuke. That chance unquestionably plays an important role. It was already evident in natural selection and mutation that it played a fundamental role with respect to Darwinian evolution. Nietzsche, with his conception of nature, takes that very, very seriously, and it is very important that you take note of that. But now what is important for Nietzsche is not really the biological organism here with respect to man. It is above all his interactions with his environment and his social environment. So that there are two things here that are important with respect to understanding man. It is to understand nature in terms of process, and this applies also to man in terms of his development. It is a philosophy that takes time with deadly seriousness. I mean, not that time is unreal or time is secondary or what have you. Just think about the philosophy, both in empiricism and in rationalism in the 18th, 17th, and the 18th century, and even the early 19th century. Spinoza, with his monism of nature, rather similar to Nietzsche's. I mean, Deus sive natura, God or nature, one. It is a whole, a monism, not a dualism like Descartes. But he notes two different attributes of this nature, infinite attributes. Those are the what? Those are the substances of Descartes. Namely, spatial extension and mind. What happens to time? Over and over again, when you read that section in history, that philosophy, they neglect forces. Their views of nature tend to be static rather than dynamic. They are not able, as a matter of fact, to deal clearly with process and development. So that you tend towards a view of nature that emphasizes matter and that mysterious way of understanding mind as something independent of matter and different from it. They talk in those terms and ignore what? They ignore time. Samuel Alexander, in a little book, Spinoza and Time, speculates, what if Spinoza had thought of making of all of these infinite attributes, of which he says we only know two, mind and extension, spatial extension, what would have happened to his philosophy if he had made one of the other attributes what? Had made one of the other attributes time. But of course there are problems along with that that's in the background, namely the resistance of philosophies and religions over the year to bring God into the cosmic process. God is immutable and unchangeable. If Spinoza had done that, and he has Deus sive natura, God or nature, making them the two, it's sort of pantheism, he would make God himself something that undergoes a process, undergoes change and transformation. And that you don't have until this century when you come to the philosophy of a process of Alfred North Whitehead. So it's very interesting to take note of that, so that the historical sciences, natural sciences that are social and historical, become very important for Nietzsche. That is, the species as a natural history of development that must be understood. Individual organisms have a development too. There is the biological development that is involved in embryology, but also, as a matter of fact, as a species, we do not simply develop embryologically. That's a biological level. Learning in society complicates the phenomenon with respect to the human species. So he stresses development, that is the history, and he is one to stress what? That there is growth over and over again. Growth. And there is decay. There is decline. This can be true on the level of the species generally, as it can also be true with respect to the individual. So that really understanding societies and human beings involves understanding them genetically. That is, genetically in the sense of the genesis and the development of those things, their growth as well as the decay and the decline, and as a social interactive process. So that for Nietzsche, you want to understand human social organizations and institutions and practices. That is of fundamental importance. If you look at societies, you have all sorts of what? Clubs, institutions, organizations, and groups, whether they are economic, monetary, penal institutions, religious institutions, and as I mentioned before, the whole host of interactive aspects of a social life. And there is this, one's participation in those social structures. I mean, there's a dynamical participation and an interaction there. You learn language. You don't make it up. About the only time you contribute anything to language is when you name perhaps your children. You learn a public language. And that is a public and social activity. Natural languages, English, happens to be spoken by a group of people that are taught the common practices. And you are taught to do just like everybody else, because those practices have social utility and a function. You learn, every one of you, over and over and over again, your ABCs. backwards and forwards and memorize it, just as you do your multiplication tables. Why is that? Because of the use to which that's going to be put. That is listing things in alphabetical order. Telephone books, filing taxes, any number of things, using a dictionary, looking up words. These are social practices and institutions. They depend upon very rigorous training, where you are taught to get it repeated back and forth over and over and over. Something that is learned, something that is conventional, that varies with respect to society and its conventions. But absolutely essential if you are to be a functioning participant in that society and that group, that you learn the language and you learn the practices and you learn it in common. One of the lessons that Nietzsche sees early, that you can't get through the heads of so many people, is the extent to which your practices are social and public, and particularly with respect to the native language you learn to speak. That the bedrock of that is uniformity of practice and training, in which you were taught, every one of you, to do the same thing the same way. There are various degrees of flexibility that arise here, but that is very, very important to take note of. It is the sort of thing that Nietzsche and Wittgenstein both share when it comes to recognizing the generally public character of natural languages that one learns, and also the utility of these things. So that's very important in understanding a society, to understand the multiplicity of institutions, the practices, what it is that you participate in and what you learn, what you share in common with a group, and into the notion of role taking. If you are going to understand human beings, don't look for a stuff or a substance when it comes to the question, who am I? What am I? Because we are a network, a nexus of social relations. Not a substance, a thing, an entity, but this concrete existing human being plays a wide number and a vast number of different roles. Role-taking is absolutely fundamental to Nietzsche's notion. It is extremely important. It follows along Hegelian lines, but it is a supplement to Hegel. And whereas Hegel speaks in rather nebulous terms of spirit here, that is at the center of the network of relations, after all, Descartes never gives a reasonable answer to the question of the res cogitans, the thinking thing. Who is this? What is it? It doesn't occur to him to say, well, I am a living organism, an animal, a human being. All of these things which are true. And that he's a Frenchman. Or does he think that's irrelevant to the question, the essence of Descartes, who he is, that he's a Frenchman, that he is a philosopher, that he's a Catholic, that he was educated at the Jesuit school at La Flèche, that he is a mathematician, a very creative mathematician, that he is a philosopher, that he is male, that that's irrelevant? I mean, the identity of a philosopher has nothing to do with the fact that he has balls, right? Has nothing to do with his essential nature in life. What absurdities. I mean, cosmic absent-mindedness, as Kierkegaard has called it, and it certainly fits with respect to Descartes and that tradition of philosophy. That is, I am a living thing that stands in a whole host of relationships to other things in nature that I cannot be cut off from and being understood and grasped totally and completely. A nexus of dynamical relations. I'm changing in those relations. That one can be a father. One can be a parent in that respect. One can be a teacher, whatever one's profession has to be. a wide variety of different social relations. And so that you can say the individual plays different roles as male, husband, father, teacher, American, the nationalism enters into it, the Catholic, whatever the religious affiliation is, on and on and on. And we play a vast number of different roles. And the roles require different tasks of us. Different sorts of training, excellences, abilities. And that is where the question comes up about integrating oneself. That notion of being egocentric, that is being unified as a person. And the unity of the person, personal identity, comes in the fact that we have the task of trying to integrate all of these different roles that we play. They can conflict. You people with some imagination ought to be able to think about cases in which we function in different roles. One's nationality and allegiance to one's country as an American could conflict with one's religious role and one's religious identification with respect to a particular church. And one can see the possibilities of conflict over and over again. As a parent, a father, that role may conflict if it so happens that at the same time you are a father, you are the teacher in a class, the professor of your child who is a student in your class. You have different responsibilities, different relationships with respect to one and the same individual, and those roles can generate conflict. What Nietzsche has, and it's interesting and important to note, once again, with that notion of change, conflict. That conflict underlies life, and it appears in the course of our life with respect to the various roles that we play, how well we play and occupy those roles, and always the possibility of conflict, stress, with respect to the individual, playing different roles and trying to resolve the conflict, which can never be resolved permanently. That is a lifetime enterprise, trying to integrate these different roles in some sort of coordinated equilibrium for a period of time. The most that one can achieve is temporary resolution of conflict. But the conflict recurs and recurs continuously at different levels. And this is very, very important for one to see. In this respect, the emphasis upon civilization and culture are very important also. And Nietzsche has a distinction between a civilization and culture, and he thinks that they are in conflict. With respect to civilization, it is a matter of urban living integrated socially for certain economic goals. That is, it's a matter of an economic mode of existence, the production and distribution of goods that are manufactured, that you have this, and the stability of that community against outside invasion and intrusion, so that you have the state, and you have the police force, and you have maintenance of what? Of peace and tranquility within the social community, so that you have the policing agencies, the punitive penal institutions, and so on. That is primarily what is meant by civilization. He thinks that an outcome of that, that's quite accidental for a number of reasons and a benefit, which is not the aim generally of a civilization, and that there's a great deal of civilizing process, which is a process of taming and domestication, is at variance with that luxurious offshoot of it, which is culture, manifested in literature, all of the arts in that respect, the literature, the arts, humanities generally, what you might call philosophy, the study of the social sciences and history, that what primarily motivates them, and with respect to the arts and philosophy, and the sciences for Nietzsche, the pure sciences. That is what he called culture. And there is a certain variance, and he has a very different and fascinating account of the interconnections possible between a civilization and a culture which it may or may not achieve. For a person that is remarkably influenced by Nietzsche and is fascinating, I mean a remarkably knowledgeable historian, the pygmies try and hack to pieces all the time because he was a towering and learned intellect. And much of what he says is speculative, and perhaps a good deal of it is dubious. That doesn't mean that there isn't a rich treasure trove there. And that is to be found in Oswald Spengler's Die Untergang des Abendlandes. I mean, that work in 1917, 1918, 2 volumes of world history dealing with civilizations and culture. If you read it, it is rich and it is fascinating. It is, of course, in the area, much of it, of speculation, but speculation is as important as well-grounded knowledge, what becomes knowledge, if it's to be possible at all, and new ways of organizing and thinking about life, nature, and history. You require very learned, very creative, and imaginative minds. That Spengler, Oswald Spengler, was. And he is obviously stealing and plundering, Spengler is, here and there, from Nietzsche. He's enormously influenced by the philosophy of Nietzsche. So, there is that notion of role-taking that is very important in understanding individuals within a given culture. I mean, they are immersed in it, so the individual is hardly understandable apart from the civilization or culture, and that means the time to which he belongs. In this respect now, something should be said about the development and emergence of self-consciousness. Nietzsche's already indicated that consciousness is a phenomenon that is primarily social because it's connected up with the mastery and learning and the use of a language. That sort of phenomenon gives rise, as a matter of fact, to consciousness. Consciousness arises when there's dynamic social interaction between different individuals. There is a need and basis for communication, and communication develops within that group, and this means the movement towards a common shared language, public language. Then consciousness can be said to be a social emergent. It's not merely biological, it's when human organisms with those capacities interact in a social level and there is communication, that consciousness becomes an emergent phenomenon. Self-consciousness, that is also social, and it's generated in a number of different ways. It is primarily rooted in social cooperation, but not merely social cooperation, but competition. That is, he wants you to take quite literally that notion of being self-conscious. Not the philosopher's goddamn instruction taken apart from the concrete circumstances of life and how we use the expression self-consciousness. One of the things I must do, I can tell when eyes glaze over when you're doing philosophy, that Your mind is idling. You're not thinking about ordinary language and our concepts from which these notions emerge. That is, when is one self-conscious? Not in isolation, solipsistically and alone. It's when you are aware that you are the object of scrutiny, that people are staring at you. You are the focus of attention, and they are evaluating you and assessing you. That is, if a person is in competition, say with respect to a shooting match, with respect to oratory, with respect to any competitive agon, sort of contest and struggle, it is when you yourself are on stage and are being scrutinized and observed and evaluated that you become extraordinarily self-conscious, conscious of you as an individual, differing from other individuals, and that is being scrutinized and appraised, observed. That is where self-consciousness arises, and where one begins to have an idea of oneself as an individual, distinct from other individuals, who is being evaluated and appraised and assessed with the possibility of being rewarded or being punished. It is in that dimension that full self-consciousness emerges. And Nietzsche stresses that, and if it sounds like something that other people have said, yes, it's been plundered by other people also. It was Nietzsche, the precursor of existentialism, not Jean-Paul Sartre, that is the originator of that conception and notion of self-consciousness and the manner in which it socially and naturalistically arises in the course of history. Another point that is very important when you reject the facultative psychology is that things like human reason, for example, as well as understanding, it has a history and it has a development. Human individuals must be taught to reason, to think rationally. That comes along with the acquisition of language. That is, as you learn various disciplines in the course of your education, you presumably learn to think with a certain rigor, rationally, but you must learn scientific method. It doesn't come to you naturally, and as a matter of fact, it's very difficult for people to practice that sort of reasoning and thinking, scientific method. With respect to logic, it doesn't come easily either. All you have to do is to do what I've done on and off during the years, and that's to teach a rigorous course of deductive logic. And goddamn, it's pretty obvious after a short time that it is not something that comes naturally to human beings. They must be disciplined to it. There are a few people that almost naturally have developed and acquired that rigor. But with respect to a good many people, it's just as foreign to them as anything could possibly be. That is, that you have any such strictures and rigor that you impose upon people's thinking. Because I've said before, the thinking of the vast majority of human beings simply does not arise beyond fantasizing. Hoping, dreaming, contemplating, planning, who they're going to lay over the weekend. That's about it. I mean, that's about the extent of it. And you people should be perfectly aware of it. And that's right here on this campus. A good percentage of the students that I've had in class have no conception of what it is to think. I mean, it's obvious from talking to them that what they call thinking is nothing beyond what? Nothing beyond mere fantasizing. So reason itself has, with respect to the species and the race, a historical development. And with respect to the individual, it is something that is acquired to a greater or lesser degree. When Aristotle defines man as the rational animal, At best, that's an ideal for humankind, capable of it. How capable of it? To what degree and to what extent? If he wanted better definitions of man than that, well, he's the laughing animal. And there are any other things that might be said about him. Laughing is much more characteristic, incidentally, than reasoning, than thinking, or rationality. One should not confuse an ideal possibility with what man is actually in his nature. So that when you talk about reason, the intellect, it is something that has a growth, a development, and one can say that it's more highly developed in some individuals than it is in others, and more highly present in some societies than it is in other societies, because it is more treasured, it is more important, it is used more extensively in a certain type of society than you will find it used and employed in other societies. A very, very important point to take note of, because, and this is important, reason, like all the higher faculties of mankind, are rooted in action. Life is primarily oriented towards action, towards handling the environment, satisfying our basic needs and desires and cravings. So that at the bottom of life, what is very fundamental is to look at action, and action that is programmed and regulated, that is practices. The practical character of reason and all of the higher forms of the human intellect. It is rooted initially in pragmatic circumstances, that is oriented towards action to satisfy basic needs, and what is fundamental is learning certain skills of a practical sort, in which, in that respect, Nietzsche is very Aristotelian. For Aristotle, theoria is something essentially contemplated. It is contemplative. It is something that develops relatively late, that not all men do not practice. It comes from that word theoria, meaning a spectacle, a vision, to view, is a luxury that arises out of practical activity and that comes relatively late. When he talks about moral philosophy, Aristotle, he talks about practical reason, and the Greek for that is phronesis. And for Nietzsche, it is phronesis. It is practical reasoning, planning, contemplating the future, considering means and working out means to certain ends that lies at the basis of, and as a matter of fact provides the motive for, engaging in theoria. In that respect, it is found that theoria, theory, can pay off with respect to enriching and improving certain of our practices. But it is in practical activity that reason, intellect, is rooted. As a matter of fact, if it were not for the practical benefits of reasoning and thinking, how important do you think, or how common would it be, or to what extent would it have been selected in the course of natural selection? I mean, it has been selected primarily because it does have a utilitarian practical value, that pragmatic aspect of it. Use with respect to the general struggle for life and maintaining life in the struggle for survival. Over and over again, Nietzsche's, even his epistemology and his thinking, is rooted in the fundamental biology of life, fundamentals of the biology of life. And this means that one takes very seriously the whole notion of not only of genetics and of inheritance, but of natural selection. And what are the factors at work? In that respect, it is not by design. You have to extirpate your thoughts and reflections that are hangovers from your theology, your religious worldview over and over again. We are not disembodied angels or souls that are created for the purpose of contemplating the cosmos, for what disinterested curiosity and knowledge, mythology, through and through. And it's very difficult to, what? Get people disabused of those notions that are very, very, very old, very difficult to shake off. That no, one wants to understand our intellectual functions and activities, then we have to understand the manner in which they are socially and biologically rooted. Particularly, and if we do that, we see the utilitarian function and the pragmatic role of those intellectual faculties of ours in life. And that's to see it in a very, very different light. I mean, what leads us to suppose that we were endowed by design to a pure contemplation of what? The ultimate metaphysical realities, ultimate metaphysical truth, that we were designed towards that end? As Nietzsche stresses over and over again, oh no, rather to the contrary, we are designed to oversimplify. Isn't that true? When you try and teach people things that are complicated, they're irritated. What they really want in a course is that you give them what? You give them a Reader's Digest. That's the type of mentality one has to deal with over and over again. Oh, simplifying Reader's Digest. Just tell me the essence of the story. Get it out. That we're oversimplifying, that we want only that which pragmatic, practical. Most people that come to school, all I want is what I can use with respect to earning a buck. The whole of our psychology is oriented towards not what it would require, the discipline, the hard work, the subtlety of trying to come to grips with nature or with reality. What one encounters is this oversimplifying type of intellect directed towards action, the bare minimum of information that will get you by. And you people recognize that and know that. In that respect, I mean, thought turns out to be something, thought of in these terms, radically different from these pure, disembodied, angelic intellects that philosophers have generally thought human beings to be, and have typically characterized them. Once more, this is a marked break with previous philosophy that characterizes over and over again Nietzsche's naturalism. All right, what would Nietzsche's reaction today be, to example, the reaction be to artificial intelligence? Well, in the first place, he would be very interested in the life sciences approach to this sort of thing, understanding the functioning of the brain and the nervous system. He would be extremely receptive to neurophysiology and would recognize that we know very, very little about ourselves from the standpoint of the brain and nervous system. That was true in Nietzsche's day. It is still true today. Don't have an inflated conception of what we know in these matters. There are some things that we do know about the mechanisms of perception, of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting. There's one hell of a lot we don't know, even about those very basic mechanisms. And we find certain aspects like seeing something and recognizing a face on the basis that we do how readily we do, very, very puzzling. We haven't an inkling about that phenomenon of recognition of such things as faces. I mean, this is exactly what people in artificial intelligence, people in neurophysiology, they're interested in exploring and finding out a lot more about. So he would certainly be very sympathetic with that. But that is an aspect of the life sciences. Now, with respect to artificial intelligence, note, we are not machines. We are living organisms. Nothing could be more fundamental than that for Nietzsche. Now, it might be that it's interesting comparison, interesting to make analogies and to compare living human beings with respect to their thought processes to machines, that the analogy might be useful. But an analogy is one thing and an identity is something else. And Nietzsche maintains that living things are absolutely irreducible to the inanimate. This is just a distinction in nature and a distinction in kind. It involves no sort of invocation of a supernatural and what? Unfathomable sort of difference there, but just to recognize that there is that difference. So in studying computers and computer programs and machines and how they function, because we use them, we employ them for certain purposes. This piece of chalk writes, I can use it for writing, it or a fountain pen, but fountain pens themselves, in and of themselves, do not write any more than a piece of chalk. I can use machines to aid me at certain tasks, like calculating. It can do it a lot faster than I do. But the machine no more calculates than the pen writes by itself. It's human agencies that use those. And by studying computers and their programs, the software and hardware, you might shed light on human mental activities like calculating. Nietzsche would have no difficulty with that at all. He would have a difficulty because there are people that not able to think through the complexities of these sorts of things at times, really ask in all seriousness, is mankind a machine? I once had a student walking across campus ask me, said, it really does bother me. Do you think that we might really just be machines? And I looked at him and I said, sweetheart, what in the world are you thinking here? I mean, do you think it's possible that you might discover someday and how that you're a goddamn disguised vacuum cleaner? Well, if that strikes you as absurd, it's no more absurd than having discovered that you are a disguised adding machine. And if adding machine sounds antiquated, that you were a disguised what? A disguised computer. I mean, in that respect, you have to ask, what are you thinking about here? I mean, how do you suppose that could be discovered? What facts could we possibly turn up to make that sort of a discovery? As a matter of fact, what would it mean to say of someone, which we might do? That's why it's so misleading. Norbert Wiener, in his cybernetics, and making comparisons with the living human organisms to machines and their function, wrote a book that was very telling in this respect, the human use of human beings. Well, one of the differences between machines and being a human being is precisely this. Human beings use machines for all sorts of purposes. And when they go wrong, they can either repair them or discard them on the junk heap. That's one sort of distinction that is very, very important. Of course, human beings have used other human beings in the past, have thought of other human beings as chattel, slaves, things de trop in the way. But we have struggled to transcend that sort of notion part and not to think of us as simply de trop, in the way, something to be used. And Kant grabbed that up when he said with respect to persons, one ought always to treat persons not merely as means, but also as ends in themselves. Well, there is a difference between what it is to be a living human being as a person and what it is to be a machine. And if we start talking about ourselves as machines and in the language of machines in which we are used, we use each other, discard them, repair them. When we are concerned with the health of other people, that's not a matter of discarding them. And it's not a matter merely of repairing them either. All of that distinction gets obliterated if you start talking about human beings in terms of machines. There is a difference, and we want to preserve the difference. And it would be conceptually devastating to abrogate the difference between living human beings and machines. That's why Norbert Wiener's book sounds so sinister, because it is. Because not like all scientists by any means, but he's like some scientists who has very little sense about how, as a matter of fact, our conceptual framework is to be utilized and employed, and how you can obliterate that whole concern with how you use science, the values that you make out of it, how you employ it. And he talks, and that's because he's a good mathematician and a good scientist in many respects. And he's not philosophically all that bad, but he really is blurry-headed when it comes to talking about questions of value and moral questions, so that he doesn't hesitate before a long time. The human use of human beings. And some of the things he says actually makes the hair go up on the back of your head, as perhaps it ought to. Now, we know, as a matter of fact, and can think of various cases. Imagine, here's a professor of philosophy. He goes into a philosophy class. He holds a particular view about human beings and nature and its role. And he says, you know, we're all really just machines. Very, very complicated sort of machines. We're organic machines. I don't know, how does he argue for this? But he gives various sorts of arguments. And one of those philosophy professors that's picked up his student and ended up marrying her. So he goes home to his wife. And after a few years, she's pretty well disillusioned by the whole business and all. And she's contemplating a divorce. And she wants to dump him. And she tells him that this is what she plans to do. And he says, but why, honey? Why? What have I done? Why do you say this? Because you're nothing but a goddamn machine. What? What, honey? Well, that's what you preach all the time anyway. And believe me, you've taught me the true meaning of it. I've lived with you all these years. Your indifference, your coldness, the extent to which you are unmoved, uncaring, unconcerned about anyone except yourself. And perhaps not even yourself sufficiently. I mean, a machine, emotionless, dead. Lord, having sex with you is like, well, fill in the blanks, but it's not a warm human body, but some sort of cold machine. Now what about it? He understands. He says, oh, I see what you mean. Does he? I mean, after all, that's the language he uses. What does it mean to talk about being a machine? What is the cash value of that? And I suggest that he's using it in a different way, and in a way that's very misleading, but he hasn't been very careful about it. And it suggests his actual usage that if you took him seriously, then you would look on human beings very, very differently. You would look upon all of them as though they were all this way, rather than there are people that are mechanical, emotionless, dead in certain respects, inert, relatively, whereas there are others that are warm, humane. You might say of them too that they have spirit, to use that language if you don't misunderstand it, or that they have a soul. And that marks the distinction very neatly. But that's a distinction between the various sorts of people. And to say of certain people that they are machines is to say something partly descriptive and partly evaluative about them, in which both elements, as a matter of fact, enter in. But there are philosophical consequences, and a lot of us would resist the consequence of talking about human beings as being, i.e., identical to machines. And it doesn't help to say a particular kind of machine or a very, very complex sort of machine. No. There is a quite categorical difference between living organisms and mere machines. And there are consequences of adopting that other language that Nietzsche foresaw and that he was determined, as a matter of fact, to resist. Now, with respect to his general conception of human nature, and he thinks philosophers are terrible about this, we have no a priori knowledge of human nature, and no a priori knowledge of ourself, of what we are. We have to learn and acquire this through experience, slowly, by observation and by experiment. There is the genetic component in human nature. That is what is hardwired, just as you have it with respect to other organisms in nature. But you also have a component that is very versatile, in that human beings learn and are capable of learning, and this is built on a sort of hardwired instinctual structure. And the two interact in very, very complex sort of ways. We learn and acquire repertoires of what? Of behaviors, conduct. And learning proceeds, for the most part, by trial and error. Trial and error. In this respect, you can say human nature, human beings, in terms of what we become and found out about ourselves, are a result of exploration, accidental findings, repetition. That is, when certain things tend to be successful, have a successful outcome, they tend to be repeated, repetition. Whereas what is not successful tends, as a matter of fact, to be eliminated, not repeated, with some very interesting qualifications about that. But that is what is involved in learning, trial and error, and our conduct is random and experimental. And Nietzsche wants to stress this with respect to life and live dangerously. We are far too conservative with respect to our traditions. We don't know enough about the possibilities of various types of economic organization and situations, or social modes of organization. We are too timid and fear, as a matter of fact, innovation, creativity, and novelty. The willingness to explore. His injunction, live dangerously, is do what is required by life if you are to grow. Live dangerously. Exploratory. Be willing to explore. Be willing to experiment. And that is addressed to individuals as well as it is addressed to societies and groups, national groups as a whole. At whatever they are, the willingness to flexibility, to creativity, to be experimental, and not, as a matter of fact, to recur to a priori conviction and prejudice about what you claim to be the case of human nature and the consequences of acting in various ways. Nietzsche stresses over and over again, we simply do not know. And we do not know very often because we are unwilling to find out. We're unwilling to hazard the chance, the risk, to explore. In that respect, this goes along with the fact we do not know the full resources of nature. All that has come into being comes out of nature's womb. But have we exhausted it? Do we know the possibilities and potential of nature? This is true with respect to human nature as to what it is capable of under given circumstances and the possibilities of its transformation under quite radically different circumstances. It's also true with respect to you and I as individuals. We do not clearly know and cannot know a priori what are our limitations with respect to our abilities. We find that out by trying. And after a certain amount of experience and trying and doing, we discover what our limits are here or there. And now there's no such stupid notion in Nietzsche as the individual doesn't have its limits. There are no limits. There are certain mythologies out there abroad that's applauded by ignorant people that do more damage than I can dare mention. That is, they tell people, and it is cruel as it can be, you're capable of anything, sweetheart. Just set your heart to it and your will, and you can go anywhere and do anything. There was never a bigger ton of bullshit and mythology than that preached. And it breaks many people's heart out there who want and desire to be this or to be that, accomplish this or accomplish that, and they struggle and they can't do it. They cannot do it. And it is terrible to have to deal with people like that. The last time I taught logic, I had to deal with that with a woman in there afterwards. And because she did well on the first 2 exams, and she thought, oh, I can just do anything. And she became as lazy as can be, for one thing. I mean, an utterly lazy bitch in that respect. But she told me that she worked and worked. She said, I'm working 8 and 10 hours every day and still not getting it. And I said, if that's true, I'd give it up. There are limitations. It's obvious you can't do it then. You can't do it. And something's wrong if you've got to work 8 and 10 hours a day and you can do no better than a D, you're in bad. That indicates something to you. And don't say, oh, but I know. And the result of that, which makes it so embittering, is those people never blame themselves, having been taught that. Who do they blame? Anybody. I mean, they want a scapegoat. And if you happen to be the unfortunate one in the position of trying to teach an incredibly bit of stupidity, just a stupid bitch, which is what she was, the blame is going to be directed towards you. And I won't take it. And I'm saying in that case, you can't do it. And you ought to learn some modesty about who and what you are. Talk about self-knowledge. And you ought to become disabused of mythologies about human nature and about what you're capable of. And that is one good case where that comes to the light. So, with respect to the self, the individual person, self, are the notion of a person. The notion of a person or the notion of a self in Nietzsche. He wants to say that one, consciousness lacks the unity that philosophers have attributed to it, as for example Kant talked about the transcendental unity of every perception. That persons lack the unity that philosophers tend to attribute to them when you talk about personal identity. That's something that is not given, as I mentioned before. It is something that is achieved. That is, with respect to our own life as human beings, our emotions and our desires, they conflict. They're at war with one another. With respect to our goals and our ambitions, sometimes they agree, but very often they conflict. That people find that the way they feel and the way they think about nature or about themselves and the world are in conflict. That is what characterizes life, again, through and through, dimension after dimension, is conflict and struggle. And our endeavoring, this is involved in growth, as it is also involved in decay, is an endeavor to achieve a resolution of conflict. To achieve a resolution of conflict. No, we do not achieve any permanent resolution. And Nietzsche thinks in that way, just as we speak of the roles that we take socially, take up, also are internalized. So that with respect to the person, and it becomes very, very obvious in the psychopathic cases, multiple personality or split personality. The notion of multiple personality, that can get way out of hand. In pathology, it does. But he wants to say in the normal cases with respect to us, those roles it internalized, they are different, and it's internalized a conflict. That is, the roles being internalized, we experience intrapsychical conflict within ourselves. So, one should try and understand individuals, the person, not as a unity, but as a multiplicity. And a multiplicity that frequently is in conflict. This is the way many psychologists want to understand human psychology and the human individual. So it's as though the individual can be understood not as a unity, but as a society or a community of, now not to use it in that old-fashioned way in which religious people have used it and dualists have used it in metaphysics, a society of souls in interaction. In this connection, this goes along with certain modern contemporary views about the nature of minds, mental capacities and abilities. It is the modular notion. It's a neurophysiological notion. Our various abilities and skills are acquired at different times. They are connected up with different parts of our anatomy, the brain and the nervous system. So that memory is acquired at one time, various perceptual functions and the ability to identify and recognize different sorts of objects, like the careful discrimination of faces. And it's amazing how far off and how remote that we can observe and recognize someone by their face, if the vision is good enough. And just think of the enormous differences with respect to faces, their physiognomies, and the possibilities of expression, and of the recognition of those. They have developed at different times so that the brain itself can be thought of as being constituted of subsystems. We do. We distinguish not only anatomically various parts of the brain, but their functions are, and the interconnection between those functions. So that with respect to our psychic life, it's as though, with respect to the community of cells, talked of that way, or with respect to the brain, it is discretely functioning interaction, but doing various and discrete tasks, performing various discrete tasks. And not necessarily serially, sometimes serially, but what? Simultaneously performing different tasks. It's like having a computer and a program and a routine and a subroutine, in which, as a matter of fact, the problem is split up and simultaneously a part of the problem is being worked on by one subroutine in the program, and another part of the problem is being worked on simultaneously by another subroutine, and so on. Various mathematical and scientific problems can be of that sort and operated on in that way. So that Nietzsche speaks, and this is very important, why should we be conscious of various bodily processes that are taking place? There are all kinds of things taking place in my body, very, very few of them that I have any awareness of, as occasionally there's an effort to belch, burp. Usually I'm not aware of these processes that take place in the body. I take an aspirin, it functions physiologically in my body, relieves the pain, but I know very, very little of its functioning. We are all taught, we believe, that insofar as we are thinking or perceiving, that all kinds of things are going on in our brain and nervous system that we are not conscious of. And that raises the question, why is it that we become conscious of certain things with respect to our body and not of other things? We're not generally conscious of the fact that we are breathing, respiring. Generally, we're only conscious of that when there's some distress involved in that function, inhibiting it so it's not functioning properly. We're generally not aware of our heart beating and so on unless there becomes a marked dysfunction, that is the pulse, or the beat is very, very rapid, or some arrhythmia, that we then become aware of the heart beating. But this is very, very interesting. With respect to computers, machines that calculate, do it, they can do that without consciousness. But what about human beings? And what Nietzsche wants to say when he stresses the unconscious is that the unconscious is much more important for us in our total life and so on than consciousness very often. And that when we take up a problem and deal with a problem, a math problem or something like that, we might be conscious of the operations that we are performing seriatim, but very, very often we are not. And that does not suggest that the brain is not functioning and working, just like a computer in parts, on certain problems. What Nietzsche has in mind and what he thinks is that it is characteristic of consciousness in formulating a task to delegate to different unconscious sub-routines, certain tasks. That this is why, as a matter of fact, we encounter phenomena like mathematicians or other people working and struggling at a problem, hitting an impasse, not being able to deal with it, waking up after a period of sleep or right in the middle of the night with a solution or an answer that occurs to us. That he thinks, as a matter of fact, that is very, very common, and that we can best understand much of our mental activities and accomplishments in terms of unconscious processes that are taking place. In that respect, he thinks what happens very often is simply this with respect to creative minds, creativeness. That it's only viable answers that generally come to consciousness with respect to disciplined and serious thinkers. That is, they're working away at a problem, and there are all kinds of possibilities. That unconsciously we are working away, a subroutine, a part of the brain, that is, can be operating and dealing with that. And it goes by trial and error. Experimental, trial and error. And that it tries one and rejects it, tries another, rejects it, tries another, rejects it. And well, possibly this. And it throws that into consciousness. And we consider that and know that won't quite work out. And then to something else is thrown into consciousness. It's very interesting in terms of the sort of experience that certain people, creative people, have. I know, not to call myself creative, but when I was doing mathematics and a graduate student, working away at problems, I would reach a point when I'd say, but I'm not seeing something here, I'm at an impasse. I mean, I'm just stopped. And I would put it away and I'd go to another problem, and go to another problem. And maybe in the midst of working another problem, suddenly, boom, it just jumped right out at me. Or I'd go to bed, and I'd wake up and go back to the problem, and you'd have the answer, or even not going back to it, it would occur to you, this is what I need to do. The solution appearing to be out of the blue. That's the way intuition seems to operate. And on Nietzsche's suggestion, what happens is that unconsciously, operation after operation, there's trial and error, and things are rejected. Until a viable one comes up, in which the system signals, here some way, possibly this, and it emerges then into consciousness. That notion of the self, of our intellect, as being divided. That is, consciousness involves a unification of things that come from various different sources. That is, these subroutines that are delegated to different aspects. And in this respect, Nietzsche would have said, it's not that we are, he would have said, it's not that we are simply digital computers operating on a yes-no, on-off basis, as many computer systems do, but also we are capable of the degrees of thinking. So it's not an on-off, a digital type computer, but it is transitional degrees, not black and white, on or off. That sort of thinking is quite different. Nietzsche recognized this and said, so that our brain is like a composite sort of mechanism, if you wanted to make that comparison, and not just a digital computer as one subroutine, but that it is like other types of calculating machines that are quite different, and also other ways of thinking by way of analogy and comparison and so on, that does not involve either a digital type of thinking, nor a thinking in terms of a continuum, a continuous, spectrum of degrees. So that he thinks, as a matter of fact, that in the course of evolution, different types of performances required. They are different types of skills that one could be thought of as localized, in different portions of the brain that's arisen at different times in the course of evolution. And these different activities then become integrated. They're not integrated. They become integrated, the interaction. And Nietzsche thinks that the contribution made from different sources to make the interconnection must enter consciousness. And then entering consciousness, the different what? The different pieces of information that is offered by different subsystems, subroutines of information processes, information processing. These are all fed into our common consciousness, because it's consciousness alone. Otherwise, it's not there, just in the brain itself as the mechanism. I mean, it must appear the different pieces of information to consciousness in which the conscious thinking agent, using symbolisms and so on, can interconnect this material into a coherent and consistent theory or an account. Once we do that, and it's articulated in consciousness, once we do that, then it can be fed back to the brain via memory and be available for it. But the point is, in order for it to be made available for integrated reactions between the different portions of the subroutines, the mechanisms of the brain, it must become accessible and available to it. That means coming to consciousness, resolving the problem, and settling it. Then it becomes a datum for what? A datum for memory, and the availability is information to do further work. All right, and now I want to address the question of will and free will, and so-called unfree will in philosophy of Nietzsche. Nietzsche thinks that the conception of the will and the notion of the will as it plays a part in most philosophies is a sheer illusion. It's chimera. It is a very, very confused notion. It is not the sort of thing that is easily accessible to introspection. Nietzsche over and over again is suspicious of any of the data that you supposedly get by introspection. I mean, he was right along with the psychologists of the 70s and 80s in Germany practicing introspection. He was one of those philosophers and thinkers who was very, very critical of the deliverances of introspection. You can't rely upon it, and that is certainly true when it comes to the deliverance of introspection with respect to memory. That over and over again you have developed a mythology of human psychology, and relying upon so-called introspection, self-observation, is a likely source of that sort of mythology and mythological conception of mental processes and what is taking place there. He thinks that talk about free will and the talk about unfree will is nonsense. That should be completely rejected. That is not the way that we should formulate the question and the issue. What we want to know is, how do you decide about the will? By introspecting? And how do you decide whether it's free or it is not free? In what sense here are you speaking of free or not with respect to this will? Do you think of it as an entity, an agency? How do you catch it? And the notion very often of free will is an event, a psychical event in you that's uncaused, a causa sui. And Nietzsche says that is a prime example of philosophical nonsense. Talk about pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. That which causes itself, causa sui. The will as a cause, a self-cause, itself uncaused, but which is a pure cause of other events. Utter mythology, and introspection doesn't give you any such information at all. So it's nonsense to speak of free will. It's also nonsense to speak of the unfree will. What we want to know is, with respect to human agents and human beings, are they free or not? Not the damn will. Is this human being free or not? And not with respect to just any goddamn thing, anything and everything. Be specific. That's where philosophers get into trouble all the time. Just talking about Überhaupt in general. Talk about specific cases. Is X and I, are you free to do this or that? What? And specify the context and the circumstances. And free in what sense? Free. Because you can have quite different senses. In that respect, I called my friend and said, I'm giving a big party next week, Saturday night, and you were invited. Are you free to come? And he says, hey, you lousy son of a bitch. What's the matter? You know I'm up here at the point of the mountain, and I'm not free to come to your party. That makes perfect. Here's where you're making good sense. You get into a philosophical frame of thinking, and you don't know what you're talking about. You're up way over your head. Talk about particular people, and are they free to do or not do what? This action, or and in what sense free? And in this respect, the person could say, he is not free because he is incarcerated. There is the sense in which a person might say, I'm not free because I'm paralyzed. I'm not free to do this or that. And reminds me, some years ago when I was in Santa Barbara, I got a phone call from this Arthur Murray dance studio. And they said, you have just won, and I knew what they were doing. They lured you in and then, socked it to you once they lured you into the club. And they said, you just won $25 worth of free lessons, Arthur Murray Studios. I said, who is this talking? Why, I'm so and so. Why? Well, who is the person that's in charge of you? The manager. Why do you want to know? I said, don't tell me you don't know, you cruel bastard. You know that I'm crippled here, been paralyzed for years, and I can't. I said, who is your supervisor? I want to know immediately. Don't you people know how to handle nuisances in your life? I learned a long time ago how to handle nuisances like that. Believe me. And there's a perfectly legitimate and good time to lie. I mean, life wouldn't be worth the candle if there wasn't the opportunity for lying and making other people just as uncomfortable as they deserve to be. In that case, I immediately got rid of this annoying caller. But it's something for you to remember and have an experience of that sort, which I made no, I'm not free to dance, to make use of your lessons, because I'm physically incapacitated, incapable of doing this type of thing. But now think of the various sorts of cases, and then you have to ask, with respect to the particular person and particular action, to specify in what way, and the important part of this is with the concept is the sense in which you are not free. That is, it may well be, and Nietzsche sees it this way, that the concept of freedom of an individual with respect to an action is that it is a defeasible concept. That is, there are many different ways in which you may not be free. And you specify, not free because, and give your various answers. And there are very, very different ways of not being free. If none of those hold that are specifiable, the presumption is the one is free. That is what is meant by a defeasible concept. And you might presume that you are free because It is not true that you are not free from this, for this sort of reason, that sort of reason, or that sort of reason. But it is not easy to be able to specify what you mean by being free. That's what is interesting, that it is the negative conception here. Not being free in particular cases that's clear. And what is not clear is that notion of freedom itself. That is why there are certain concepts that you can say they're defeasible, that at any particular time, and you might be mistaken in thinking you were free, because it might come out that there is a sense or circumstances in which you are not free with respect to the action at issue. This is a very subtle point, and that is why I say what Nietzsche's position is on the question of human freedom, the question of free will, he says that's nonsense. You don't get anywhere. Your head just is in a complete whirl when you talk about it that way. What we're interested in is human beings and whether they're free to do this or that, this particular action, and the sense in which they are not free. And ask philosophers then, if you really want, what do you mean by free? Is there a general definition and an explanation of what you mean by freedom? Or is it not the case that you learn that notion defeasibly that way? That is, you ascribe freedom to an agent respecting an action if you cannot specify the sense in which he is unfree. That is Nietzsche's view. It is an extremely sophisticated view given the time at which it appeared, in which you might ask, if you, any of you think you're so smart about this issue, you define free will, what in the hell that means. But apart from that, you define what it is for an agent to be free, not überhaupt in general, that's not going to get you anywhere. Free with respect to a particular action. There is another Nietzschean observation that is quite interesting in this connection. When people suppose that they aren't free to do anything, and that all of our behavior is completely causally accounted for. Nietzsche, this goes right along with what I told you his position was about chance and denying classical determinism. Classical determinism is like that of Laplace in the celestial mechanics, who talk about classical determinism. If you had an all-knowing God who knew the position of every particle in the universe at a given time, instant, its position and its velocity, he could predict the whole future course of nature of the universe forever after from that bit of data, given the laws of nature. And that's the laws of mechanics, that he could do that. Nietzsche rejects any such classical determinism and any such ground for denying that human agents are free. Though also he doesn't think that the existence of chance, non-determinism, automatically makes intelligible the notion of being free. And he's quite right about that also. That does not ground what it is for an agent to be free. In that respect, if, for example, it would not be a justification of freedom, free will, if you say, well, all the events in nature are not causally determined. So that as a matter of fact, with respect to some of the things I do, it may be the result of a chance or random slip of an electron in orbit in my nervous system, or several of them. That's utterly mad. That's not going to give you freedom. I mean, I can imagine walking down the street and looking over there and saying, oh, there's a bar over there. I think it'd be nice to have a drink in the afternoon. And I start watching, and I find myself veering across the street and flopping down in Snell Road and asking for an ice cream soda. And, well, how do you explain this? Well, there I'm on my way over to the bar, and those electrons in orbit my nervous system. Ice cream soda. In that respect, chance, the lack of determinism, does not give you freedom, free agency. Because as a matter of fact, the whole notion of me being responsible for my actions and all, it's such that I do it. I choose to do it, and I bring it about. Now, if what happens is a result of something happening to me, not something that I do, something happening to me, like these electrons slipping orbit in my brain and nervous system, I don't cause that. That's what you mean by being uncaused. And if my actions were a consequence of that, then it's not something I do or cause. It's something that capriciously happens to me. So that would not give me causality. I mean, that would not give me freedom. And Nietzsche asked, what is it that does give you freedom in part? And suppose that I invited you, or you invited me, to a party at your place 2 weeks from now. Says, Fred, can you come to my party? It's going to be on Saturday night, 10th of June. Well, what would you think if I said, I don't know. Why ask me? I don't know my whole history and past, and I don't know my genetic makeup, and it's all a matter of genes. It's all a matter of what your biology, your genetic, and your past experience. I don't know. Why ask me? That would be utterly crazy, wouldn't it? And you know what happens? And Nietzsche sees this. Not knowing anything about my genetic makeup, nor knowing that much about my past that's relevant, causally. You ask me, and off the top of my head, I said, no, I can't. I've got a prayer appointment. Or I said, yes, I'll be there. And is that just a goddamn guess? Because more often than not, when I say that I will be there at the party at such and such, I am there. There may be things that I cannot anticipate. Car wreck, something that comes up in the meantime. But you people do that over and over and over again yourselves. You are able to promise and commit yourself to do something, and then to do it. And how would you be able to do that if you were just an automaton? I mean, if it were just a matter to take it seriously, well, you know, it's just a product of my genetic makeup and my experience, that ought to make you very suspicious of that. And that was a very interesting observation of Nietzsche's. So that in many respects, what he has to say about freedom, you don't get it from determinism, causal determinism, and you don't get it from a denial of determinism. So the interesting question is, how is it that, what is the basis of speaking of agents being free about certain actions? And now you can blab away free will all you like. The scholastics never knew what they were talking about when they were talking about free will, or lack of free will. And it muddies up the problem, because you start doing this sort of constipated inner gazing in trying to figure out whether you could do or not do some action or other. And that's going to get you nowhere. That is going to get in you. As a matter of fact, I wonder if I can finish the... No, that free will, that's just getting started. I mean, that notion of human freedom. Nietzsche has a lot to do on that issue of responsibility and human freedom. So he talked about being free with respect to this or that action, but not freedom überhaupt. And you don't talk at all about free will, or the lack of free will. That's just a dead end. Okay.